Rick Sanchez's defining trait is not intelligence, nihilism, or cruelty. It is fear. Not fear of death, insignificance, or even loneliness, but fear of being wrong. Wrong about the universe. Wrong about meaning. Wrong about the choices he made when things first broke, and he decided how to survive afterward. Everything Rick does can be traced back to protecting himself from that possibility. Rick presents his worldview as settled fact. The universe is indifferent, meaning is artificial, attachment is a liability, and intelligence is the only reliable tool. He does not argue these points as beliefs. He states them as conclusions. This framing matters. Beliefs can be challenged. Conclusions imply finality. Rick does not want discussion because discussion introduces doubt, and doubt is where his fear lives. If Rick were merely confident, he would not need to perform certainty so aggressively. His contempt for others is not casual, it is defensive. He does not simply disagree with opposing ideas, he annihilates them. Religions, governments, therapy, morality, family structures, and even other versions of himself are all treated with the same reflexive hostility. This is not because Rick has carefully evaluated each one and found them lacking. It is because each one threatens the stability of his conclusions. If any system he mocks turns out to work, then his choices become questionable. Rick's intelligence functions less as a gift and more as insulation. Knowledge allows him to stay ahead of questions he does not want to answer. Being the smartest person in the room means no one can corner him into introspection. He controls conversations the same way he controls environments, by overwhelming them. He fills space with information, jokes, and chaos so that nothing quiet enough for reflection can survive. Being wrong for Rick would not mean making a mistake. He makes mistakes constantly. It would mean that his core assumptions failed to protect him. It would mean that the emotional distance he cultivated was not necessary, that his detachment caused harm that did not have to happen, and that the suffering he carries was not the unavoidable price of awareness, but the result of avoidance. That possibility is intolerable. This is why Rick rejects systems that frame pain as something to be integrated rather than escaped. Therapy is not threatening because it criticizes him, but because it suggests revision. Moral frameworks are not threatening because they judge him, but because they imply that different choices were possible. Hope is dangerous, not because it is naive, but because it introduces a counterfactual, a version of Rick who stayed, tried, failed openly, and lived with the consequences instead of running from them. Rick's obsession with control makes this clearer. He will dominate physics, biology, entire civilizations, and even narrative logic itself, but he refuses to control himself. External control is safe because it does not require self-revision. Internal change would mean admitting that his past self made decisions that could have gone another way. Rick would rather reshape reality than reshape responsibility. This is why Rick does not fix worlds. He replaces them. When something breaks beyond his tolerance, he abandons it entirely. Replacement preserves his belief that nothing is worth repairing. Repair would imply investment, and investment would imply that the thing mattered enough to be saved. Being wrong would mean admitting that something he discarded was worth the effort. The multiverse is Rick's greatest shield. Infinite alternatives allow him to treat every outcome as provisional. If something goes wrong, it does not reflect on him, it reflects on that universe. This dispersal of consequence is how Rick avoids accountability without explicitly denying it. He does not say responsibility does not exist. He makes it untraceable. Rick's relationship with Morty exposes this fear most clearly. Morty is not a threat because he is weak. He is a threat because he still believes that Rick might be wrong. Morty feels guilt, confusion, and hope without immediately converting them into cynicism. He suffers openly. He asks questions Rick refuses to ask himself. Morty represents a version of survival that does not rely on certainty as armor. Rick oscillates between protecting Morty and undermining him because Morty destabilizes Rick's conclusions simply by continuing to care. Morty's persistence suggests that the universe's indifference does not automatically negate attachment. If Morty can survive without Rick's worldview, then Rick's worldview is not inevitable. That implication terrifies him. Rick's cruelty toward Morty often spikes when Morty shows moral clarity or emotional resilience. These moments challenge Rick's belief that awareness leads inevitably to detachment. Rick cannot allow that challenge to stand unpunished. If Morty proves that care can coexist with intelligence and suffering, then Rick's choices become a matter of preference rather than necessity. Rick's hatred of authority follows the same pattern. Authority claims that some structures exist beyond individual preference. Rick cannot tolerate that claim because it would mean that his rejection of structure was not insight, but reaction. He dismantles authority not to liberate others, but to prevent comparison. As long as everything is arbitrary, Rick cannot be judged against a standard he did not invent. Even Rick's nihilism is not neutral, it is selective. He dismisses cosmic meaning but fiercely protects his own interpretations. He mocks belief systems while clinging to his certainty with religious intensity. True nihilism would accept uncertainty. Rick does not. He replaces meaning with certainty and calls it honesty. Being wrong would force Rick to sit with ambiguity. It would require him to admit that he does not know whether his choices were justified, only that they were survivable. That distinction matters. Survival does not equal correctness. Rick equates the two because admitting otherwise would destabilize his identity. Rick's self-destructive behavior reinforces this reading. His substance abuse, recklessness, and disregard for his own safety function as proof of conviction. If nothing matters, then self-preservation is optional. But this behavior is not freedom, it is demonstration. Rick is constantly trying to prove to himself that his worldview is real by acting as though consequences do not apply to him. Yet consequences do apply. They accumulate quietly. Rick becomes more isolated, more brittle, more reactive. His relationships thin. His defenses harden. These changes contradict his claim that detachment is liberating. Instead of revising the claim, Rick doubles down. Being wrong would mean acknowledging that his armor is hurting him. Rick's refusal of time travel fits perfectly into this pattern. Time travel would force him to confront moments where different choices were possible. It would collapse his belief that everything unfolded as it had to. By refusing to engage with time travel, Rick preserves the idea that the past is fixed and therefore not subject to evaluation. If it cannot be changed, it cannot indict him. This fear also explains why Rick resists redemption arcs. Redemption implies that something was wrong and can now be corrected. Rick prefers endurance to redemption because endurance does not require reevaluation. He can continue without admitting error. Growth would require him to name what failed. Rick is not afraid of meaninglessness. He is afraid that meaning might exist in forms he dismissed prematurely. He is afraid that connection might have been survivable. He is afraid that pain might have been faced instead of fled. Being wrong would not simply hurt his pride. It would force him to grieve choices he treated as inevitable. The tragedy of Rick Sanchez is not that he sees the universe clearly and suffers because of it. It is that he sees clearly enough to know he might be wrong and builds his entire identity around never finding out. His intelligence allows him to outrun doubt, but it cannot eliminate it. His certainty keeps him functional, but it does not keep him whole. And every time the universe offers evidence that care, responsibility, or uncertainty might be viable, Rick reacts not with curiosity, but with violence, humor, or escape. Rick chooses certainty over growth because certainty protects him from revision. Being wrong would mean reopening wounds he sealed long ago. It would mean admitting that his pain was not the price of truth, but the cost of avoidance. Rick Sanchez is not afraid of the universe. He is afraid of the moment he might have to say that the way he survived was not the only way he could have lived. Rick's fear of being wrong also explains why he treats sincerity as a liability. Sincerity is dangerous because it removes ambiguity. When someone is sincere, they reveal what they value. Values create standards. Standards create the possibility of failure. Rick avoids sincerity because it would force him to acknowledge that some things matter enough to risk being judged by their outcome. Irony, sarcasm, and exaggeration keep everything provisional. Nothing he says has to be defended if it was never fully meant. This is why Rick's rare moments of emotional honesty are immediately destabilizing. When he allows himself to care openly, even briefly, the fallout is severe. He withdraws, lashes out, or self-destructs soon after. These reactions are not contradictions, they are course corrections. Sincerity opens the door to being wrong. Rick closes it as fast as possible. His relationship with family illustrates this pattern clearly. Family represents a system where being wrong has consequences that cannot be escaped through intellectual dominance. You cannot out-argue disappointment or reason your way out of neglect. Family remembers, family compares, family notices patterns. Rick tolerates family only when he can control the terms of engagement. When those terms shift toward accountability, his behavior deteriorates. Rick's hostility toward Jerry is not about weakness, it is about exposure. Jerry openly fails, openly wants approval, and openly hopes for validation. Jerry is wrong constantly, and he survives it. That survival undermines Rick's belief that being wrong is fatal. Rick's contempt is a reaction to that threat. Jerry represents a way of living that absorbs failure instead of annihilating it. Rick cannot accept that alternative because it reframes his own avoidance as unnecessary. Beth is more complicated. She mirrors Rick's fear while disguising it as ambition. Her need for validation and authority echoes Rick's need for certainty. Rick recognizes himself in her, and that recognition is unsettling. Beth's attempts to justify herself through competence and approval threaten to reveal the generational cost of Rick's worldview. If Beth's pain can be traced back to his influence, then Rick's philosophy stops being abstract and starts being causal. Rick's dynamic with authority figures outside the family follows the same logic. He does not merely oppose authority, he humiliates it. Humiliation ensures that no authority figure can plausibly be right in a way that reflects back on him. Destroying credibility is easier than confronting comparison. Rick does not want to know whether he made the best choices. He wants to eliminate the possibility of measurement. Even Rick's cruelty has structure. It escalates most sharply when others express certainty about values he has rejected. Hope, faith, commitment, and responsibility provoke disproportionate reactions. These ideas are not threatening because they are wrong, but because they might not be. Rick attacks them before they can be tested against his own life. This fear also shapes Rick's relationship with failure. He reframes failure as evidence of futility rather than feedback. If effort fails, the conclusion is not that the approach was flawed, but that effort itself is meaningless. This reframing preserves his certainty at the cost of learning. Being wrong would require him to distinguish between a failed attempt and a false premise. Rick collapses the two to avoid revision. Rick's reliance on spectacle serves the same purpose. Spectacle overwhelms interpretation. When everything is extreme, nothing can be examined quietly. Loudness replaces clarity. Chaos replaces reflection. Rick creates environments where speed and intensity prevent slow, evaluative thought. This is not accidental. Stillness is where doubt grows. Over time, Rick's fear of being wrong hardens into identity. He no longer defends his worldview because it is useful. He defends it because without it, he does not know who he is. Certainty becomes selfhood. Any challenge becomes an existential threat. This is why Rick reacts to critique as though it were violence. It is not disagreement he fears, but erasure. What makes this tragic, rather than monstrous, is that Rick is not ignorant of his own avoidance. He senses it. His self-loathing is not vague. It is specific but unnamed. He punishes himself because punishment does not require understanding. Understanding would require change. Being wrong would require grief, not just pain. Pain can be endured. Grief demands reevaluation. Rick's fear also explains why he oscillates between isolation and dependence. He pushes people away to avoid scrutiny, then pulls them close when isolation threatens collapse. This cycle creates the illusion of volatility, but it is stable in its repetition. Rick is not confused about what he wants. He wants connection without the risk of being wrong about its value. That combination is impossible, and the impossibility fuels his instability. Even when Rick performs sacrifice, it is often framed in ways that preserve his certainty. Sacrifice becomes proof that he understands how meaningless everything is, rather than evidence that he values something enough to give it up. He reframes care as strategy or inevitability to avoid acknowledging it as choice. Being wrong in Rick's internal logic is not a moment. It is a chain reaction. It would mean revisiting every decision that followed the initial break. It would mean admitting that intelligence did not force detachment, that pain did not require abandonment, and that survival did not demand cruelty. That scale of revision is overwhelming. Rick chooses stasis over collapse. The irony is that Rick's fear keeps him trapped in the very condition he claims to transcend. He is not free from meaning. He is enslaved to a single interpretation of it. He is not above judgment. He is terrified of it. His certainty is not strength. It is containment. Rick Sanchez is afraid of being wrong because being wrong would require him to live in a universe where he chose his path, not one where it was dictated by truth. It would mean his suffering was not the cost of seeing clearly, but the cost of refusing to see alternatives. That possibility lingers beneath everything he does, and no amount of intelligence, control, or certainty has been able to erase it. Rick's fear of being wrong also reshapes how he understands responsibility. Responsibility, in its simplest form, requires the belief that one's choices meaningfully affect outcomes. Rick outwardly rejects this belief by framing the universe as indifferent and causality as a joke. But this rejection is selective. He refuses responsibility not because it is false, but because it is destabilizing. Accepting responsibility would require him to acknowledge that his intelligence did not merely reveal the world as it is, but actively shaped the damage within it. This is why Rick treats responsibility as something imposed from the outside, rather than generated from within. When consequences arrive, he experiences them as interruptions, not results. The narrative reinforces this by allowing consequences to surface unevenly, often long after the initiating action. This delay gives Rick psychological cover. If consequences are diffuse, they are harder to trace back to a single choice. The illusion of inevitability protects him from the clarity that being wrong would bring. Rick's fear also explains his relationship with legacy. He does not want to be remembered accurately. He wants to be remembered as inevitable. If he is inevitable, then his flaws become features of the universe rather than failures of character. This is why he resists interpretation. He mocks attempts to understand him, psychoanalyze him, or contextualize his behavior. Understanding would make him legible, and legibility makes evaluation possible. Being wrong would mean that his legacy is not the result of cosmic truth, but of personal limitation. Rick cannot tolerate that reframing. It would mean that future versions of himself, or those shaped by him, could reasonably choose differently. That possibility undermines his self-image as someone who simply saw too much too clearly to do anything else. This fear manifests in how Rick relates to time. He is comfortable with the future as abstraction and the present as chaos, but deeply uncomfortable with the past as something to be examined. Examination invites comparison. Comparison invites judgment. By treating the past as fixed and emotionally sealed, Rick prevents reinterpretation. Being wrong would require reopening the past not as fate, but as decision. Rick's refusal to meaningfully engage with regret follows the same pattern. Regret implies that an alternative path was viable. Rick reframes regret as sentimentality, weakness, or biological noise. This reframing preserves his certainty. If regret is illegitimate, then revision is unnecessary. Pain becomes background radiation rather than information. The tragedy is that Rick's fear does not actually protect him from being wrong. It only protects him from knowing whether he is. His life becomes a continuous experiment designed to avoid falsification. He does not test his beliefs against lived alternatives. He destroys alternatives before they can mature. This is not skepticism. It is control over time. This control hollows out his relationships. People around Rick are not allowed to grow in ways that challenge his worldview. When they do, he destabilizes them, mocks them, or leaves. This ensures that his environment remains consistent with his assumptions. The cost is isolation, but isolation is preferable to contradiction. Rick's rare moments of vulnerability reveal how fragile this system is. When he allows himself to feel loss without immediately reframing it, his behavior becomes erratic. He spirals not because he is weak, but because vulnerability introduces the possibility of revision. Feeling without explanation destabilizes his certainty. He reacts by trying to restore equilibrium through destruction, escape, or numbness. The show never presents Rick's fear as irrational. It presents it as understandable and deeply human. Being wrong at Rick's scale would not be a simple correction. It would be an existential collapse. It would mean accepting that intelligence did not force his isolation, that the universe did not demand his cruelty, and that survival did not require him to abandon care. That realization would demand grief rather than cynicism. Grief is the one emotional state Rick consistently avoids. Pain can be anesthetized. Anger can be externalized. Grief requires acknowledgement. It requires staying with loss long enough to feel its full weight. Being wrong would mean grieving not just people or events, but versions of himself that never came to be. Rick cannot face that without losing the identity he has built. This is why Rick's arc does not move toward redemption in a traditional sense. Redemption would imply that being wrong is survivable. The show does not offer that reassurance. Instead, it shows incremental erosion, small cracks in certainty, brief acknowledgments, moments where Rick acts against his stated beliefs without reclassifying the action as strategy or accident. These moments matter not because they resolve his fear, but because they expose it. Each unguarded act of care suggests that Rick's worldview is not airtight. Each unacknowledged sacrifice implies that meaning leaks through even the strongest defenses. Rick does not confront these leaks directly. He contains them. But containment is not the same as elimination. In the end, Rick Sanchez is not afraid of being wrong because he values correctness too highly. He is afraid because being wrong would force him to confront the possibility that he chose certainty over vulnerability, escape over repair, and control over connection, not because the universe demanded it, but because he did. That realization would not destroy his intelligence. It would destroy his justification. And so Rick continues as he is, brilliant, capable, and deeply constrained by the one thing he refuses to test. His fear does not make him weak. It makes him consistent. But consistency is not truth. It is only stability. Rick Sanchez survives by never finding out whether the life he built was the only one possible. Rick's fear of being wrong also explains why he is so invested in inevitability as a concept. He frames events as unavoidable, outcomes as predetermined by intelligence, trauma, or cosmic indifference. Inevitability removes agency retroactively. If something had to happen, then no alternative self was ever viable. Rick leans on inevitability not because it is philosophically rigorous, but because it anesthetizes comparison. Comparison is where guilt forms. This is why Rick repeatedly collapses complexity into blunt conclusions. Subtlety creates space for interpretation, and interpretation creates space for responsibility. Rick prefers absolutes because absolutes cannot be negotiated with. Nothing matters. Everyone is replaceable. Love is chemical noise. These are not discoveries, they are barricades. Each one shuts down a line of questioning that might otherwise turn inward. Rick's contempt for hope follows the same logic. Hope implies uncertainty about the future. It implies that present conditions are not final. Rick cannot tolerate that implication because uncertainty reopens the question of whether his current state is justified. Hope threatens to turn endurance into stagnation. If change is possible, then refusing it becomes a choice rather than a consequence. This is also why Rick reacts so violently to moments of optimism or emotional clarity in others. These moments function as living counter-arguments. They do not debate Rick's worldview, they bypass it. Someone caring without justification undermines his claim that caring is irrational. Someone changing without cosmic permission undermines his claim that growth is dishonest. Rick does not argue with these moments. He crushes them or flees from them. His fear of being wrong even shapes how he relates to success. Success is dangerous because it invites evaluation. If something works, it raises the question of why it worked and whether it could have been pursued earlier or differently. Rick often sabotages success before it can stabilize. He disrupts systems just as they begin to function. This prevents success from becoming evidence against his worldview. Rick's pattern of escalation fits neatly into this frame. When situations threaten to become manageable, he destabilizes them. Manageability implies that problems can be addressed incrementally. Incremental change suggests that extreme detachment was unnecessary. Rick chooses chaos over manageability because chaos supports his belief that nothing can be fixed, only survived. This fear also explains why Rick's moments of apparent humility are fleeting and incomplete. He may acknowledge fault in abstract terms, but he resists specificity. Specificity would anchor error to a particular choice rather than to existence itself. Rick prefers to blame the universe, intelligence, or inevitability because those forces cannot be corrected. Being wrong about a specific decision would imply that future decisions could be different. The show repeatedly places Rick in situations where he could test his beliefs by staying, committing, or repairing. Each time he finds a way to reframe withdrawal as insight. Leaving becomes proof of understanding. Detachment becomes proof of strength. Escape becomes wisdom. These reframings are not self-delusion in a simple sense. They are survival narratives carefully maintained over time. Rick's fear also sheds light on why he is so intolerant of ambiguity when it concerns himself, yet comfortable with it elsewhere. He embraces paradox, contradiction, and uncertainty as intellectual play, but not as personal condition. When ambiguity touches his own motives or past actions, he becomes defensive. Intellectual ambiguity is safe. Emotional ambiguity threatens identity. This distinction is critical. Rick is not afraid of complexity. He is afraid of implication. Implication connects belief to consequence. Being wrong would mean tracing a line from what he thought to what he did, and then to what happened to others. That line is what he refuses to follow. Even Rick's self-awareness functions defensively. He knows he is damaged. He knows he avoids connection. He knows he hurts people, but he knows these things in a way that forecloses change. Awareness becomes a terminus rather than a starting point. Being wrong would require him to treat awareness as a reason to act differently rather than as proof of insight. The cumulative effect of this fear is not stagnation, but repetition. Rick repeats patterns under the guise of variety. New worlds, new threats, new inventions, but the same exits. The illusion of movement masks the absence of revision. Being wrong would mean breaking the loop rather than accelerating it. What makes Rick compelling rather than static is that the fear never fully succeeds. It is constantly threatened by moments he cannot fully rationalize away. Acts of care that do not fit his framework. Losses that hurt more than his philosophy allows. Connections that persist despite his efforts to sever them. These moments do not redeem him, but they destabilize him. The show does not present Rick's fear as something to be conquered. It presents it as something to be exposed. Exposure is quieter than transformation. It does not resolve the problem. It reveals its shape. Over time, the audience sees that Rick's certainty is not the absence of doubt, but the management of it. In the end, Rick Sanchez is afraid of being wrong, because being wrong would mean that the life he built is not a monument to truth, but a workaround for pain. It would mean that intelligence did not force him into isolation, that the universe did not demand his cruelty, and that meaning was not eliminated by awareness, only made more fragile. Rick chooses certainty because certainty allows him to keep moving without looking back. Being wrong would require him to stop, to grieve, and to accept that survival and correctness are not the same thing. The tragedy is not that Rick might be wrong. It is that he has made being right the condition for continuing to exist as he is. And as long as that condition holds, growth will always feel more dangerous to him than despair. Rick's fear of being wrong also determines how he treats forgiveness, both given and received. Forgiveness implies that harm occurred unnecessarily. It suggests that damage was not simply an unavoidable side effect of reality, but the result of choices that could have been made differently. Rick cannot tolerate that implication. To forgive, or to ask for forgiveness, would mean admitting that the harm he caused was not cosmically mandated, but personally authored. When Rick appears to accept blame, he often does so in a way that neutralizes its force. He collapses responsibility into inevitability, presenting his actions as the only rational response to an irrational universe. This is not denial, it is reframing. By treating harm as a structural feature of existence rather than a consequence of his decisions, Rick preserves his certainty. Being wrong would require him to locate harm in specific moments where he could have chosen otherwise. This is also why Rick avoids sustained repair. Repair is different from apology. Repair requires time, consistency, and vulnerability. It requires staying long enough for outcomes to be evaluated. Rick avoids repair because evaluation is where wrongness becomes visible. A repaired relationship might demonstrate that effort mattered, that presence mattered, and that abandonment was not the only viable option. Rick prefers exits to experiments. Rick's discomfort with forgiveness also explains his hostility toward emotional accountability. Emotional accountability does not demand perfection, it demands acknowledgement. Acknowledgement creates a record. A record can be revisited. Rick does not want a record of himself that contradicts his self-image as someone acting under the constraints of truth rather than choice. This fear reaches its sharpest edge when Rick is confronted with versions of himself who made different decisions. Alternate Ricks are not threatening because they are smarter or more ruthless, but because they are evidence. Each variant demonstrates that intelligence alone does not dictate outcome. Different Ricks arrive at different lives, despite similar capabilities. That diversity of outcome undermines Rick's belief in inevitability. If other versions chose differently, then his choices stop looking necessary. Rick responds to this threat by flattening difference. Other Ricks are mocked, instrumentalized, or erased. Individuality among them is treated as superficial. This erasure preserves his certainty. If all Ricks are essentially the same, then variation does not imply choice. Being wrong would require Rick to acknowledge that intelligence permits multiple paths, not just one. This is also why Rick is obsessed with hierarchy. Hierarchy simplifies comparison. If he is at the top, then difference below him is irrelevant. Hierarchy allows Rick to avoid lateral comparison, where alternative choices become visible. He does not want peers, he wants subordinates or abstractions. Being wrong becomes harder to imagine when no equal exists to contradict him. Rick's fear also shapes how he experiences love. Love is not just attachment, it is endorsement. To be loved is to be seen as worthy despite flaws. That worthiness challenges Rick's belief that his detachment is justified by truth. If someone can love him without demanding certainty or control, then his defenses begin to look excessive. Love suggests that being wrong might not be fatal. This is why Rick often undermines love at moments when it becomes visible. He reframes it as dependency, manipulation, or weakness. He prefers transactional relationships because transactions can be evaluated without vulnerability. Love resists evaluation. It does not prove itself through outcomes, it simply persists. Persistence without justification terrifies Rick. Rick's fear of being wrong also clarifies why he confuses insight with resignation. He treats acceptance of suffering as wisdom, even when that acceptance is premature. Resignation allows him to stop asking whether something could have been different. Insight, in contrast, would require him to stay with that question. Rick stops inquiry, not because it leads nowhere, but because it leads somewhere he cannot bear to go. The show repeatedly demonstrates that Rick is not incapable of change. He is capable of it in bursts. What he resists is sustained revision. Revision would require him to hold two truths at once: that he survived the way he did, and that he did not have to survive that way forever. That coexistence is intolerable to him. He needs his past to justify his present absolutely. As time passes, Rick's fear becomes less explosive and more procedural. It settles into habit. Avoidance becomes automatic. Certainty becomes reflexive. He no longer needs to consciously defend his worldview because it has hardened into structure. This makes the fear harder to see, not weaker. It operates beneath behavior rather than through it. What keeps the fear visible is contradiction. Rick continues to act in ways that do not align with his stated beliefs. He protects without credit. He hesitates. He returns when escape would be easier. These actions do not overthrow his certainty, but they puncture it. Each puncture is quickly sealed, but the accumulation matters. The show does not present these moments as evidence that Rick is secretly hopeful or on a path to redemption. It presents them as friction. Friction between who Rick says he is and what he sometimes does. That friction is the narrative space where his fear of being wrong becomes legible. Being wrong, in Rick's internal logic, would not be a single admission. It would be a cascade. It would force him to admit that his intelligence did not entitle him to detachment, that his pain did not excuse his cruelty, and that his certainty was not the same as truth. It would require him to live without armor. Rick does not choose despair because he loves it. He chooses it because despair is stable. It does not demand reevaluation. It does not surprise him. Growth, in contrast, is volatile. It destabilizes identity. Being wrong would mean accepting that instability without the guarantee that something better would replace it. The final cruelty of Rick's fear is that it locks him into a life he believes he transcended. He claims to be free from illusion, yet he clings to one illusion above all others: that his way of surviving was the only honest way to live. Rick Sanchez is afraid of being wrong, not because he cannot survive error, but because error would reveal that he already survived it and kept running anyway. Rick's fear of being wrong ultimately functions as a refusal to re-author his own story. He lives inside a narrative where his intelligence uncovered a harsh truth, and his detachment was the only rational response. That narrative is not simply descriptive, it is protective. It gives his past a shape that does not require reinterpretation. Being wrong would mean that the story he has been telling himself is not an explanation, but a draft he refused to revise. Revision is the real threat. Revision implies that identity is not fixed by insight, but shaped by choice over time. Rick can tolerate the idea that people are replaceable, that universes are interchangeable, and that outcomes are arbitrary. But he cannot tolerate the idea that he himself could have evolved differently if he had stayed. The possibility of revision does not just challenge his beliefs, it challenges the coherence of his life. This is why Rick treats change as something that happens to others, but not to him. He observes development, decay, and transformation everywhere, yet frames himself as static. Static identity allows him to avoid historical responsibility. If he is fundamentally the same person he has always been, then his earlier decisions do not need to be reevaluated. They simply express an unchanging truth. Being wrong would introduce time into his self-concept, and time is where accountability accumulates. Rick's relationship with progress follows the same pattern. He believes in technological progress, but rejects emotional or moral progress as illusion. This selective belief allows him to continue advancing outward while remaining inwardly frozen. If emotional progress were real, then stagnation would be a choice rather than an inevitability. Rick cannot accept that framing without destabilizing his certainty. The show repeatedly demonstrates that Rick is not incapable of reflection. He is incapable of staying with it. Reflection begins and is immediately interrupted by action, humor, or escalation. This interruption is not distraction, it is defense. Stillness allows counterfactuals to surface. Counterfactuals lead directly to the question Rick avoids most. What if this was not the only way? That question is devastating not because it promises a better outcome, but because it reveals contingency. Contingency undermines destiny. Rick depends on the idea that his life unfolded according to unavoidable logic. Being wrong would mean accepting that contingency existed and was rejected, not disproven. Rick's obsession with forward motion reinforces this avoidance. He moves constantly between planets, universes, conflicts, and projects. Motion prevents reevaluation. As long as he is moving, he does not have to reconcile past and present. Being wrong would require him to stop long enough for the past to catch up emotionally, not just conceptually. This also explains why Rick's moments of apparent peace are so unstable. Peace suggests alignment between belief and experience. Rick cannot sustain that alignment because his experience keeps contradicting his beliefs. He feels loss, he feels attachment, he feels hesitation. These experiences do not fit neatly into his worldview. Rather than revising the worldview, Rick treats the experiences as malfunctions. The fear of being wrong transforms these contradictions into irritants rather than information. Information would invite adjustment. Irritation invites suppression. Rick suppresses by reframing, escalating, or abandoning. Each suppression preserves certainty while increasing internal friction. Over time, this friction becomes visible as exhaustion. Rick's brilliance remains, but his resilience erodes. His certainty grows louder as his stability weakens. This inversion is not accidental. The more effort required to maintain certainty, the more fragile it becomes. Being wrong would shatter it quickly. Maintaining it requires constant work. The show never suggests that Rick's fear will be resolved cleanly. There is no revelation waiting that will liberate him from it. Instead, the fear is treated as an ongoing condition, manageable, corrosive, and human. Rick survives not because he is right, but because he has built a system that allows him to avoid finding out whether he is wrong. That system includes intelligence, sarcasm, control, escape, and certainty. Each component reinforces the others. Remove one, and the structure weakens. Remove certainty, and the rest collapse. Rick understands this instinctively. His fear is not irrational. It is strategic. What makes Rick tragic, rather than static, is that the strategy works just well enough to keep him alive, but not well enough to make him whole. He continues, but at a cost that quietly increases. Being wrong would force him to pay that cost all at once in the form of grief, regret, and revision. He chooses instead to pay it slowly, through isolation and repetition. In the end, Rick Sanchez is afraid of being wrong because being wrong would not simply correct a belief. It would dismantle a life organized around never needing correction. It would mean that truth did not demand his detachment, that survival did not require his cruelty, and that intelligence did not absolve him from choice. Rick does not fear error. He fears responsibility for the shape his life took once error was possible. And as long as that fear remains, certainty will always feel safer to him than growth, even when certainty is the very thing that keeps him trapped. Rick's fear of being wrong also explains why he treats endings as threats rather than relief. Endings force evaluation. When something ends, it can be assessed. Patterns can be traced. Decisions can be weighed against outcomes. Rick resists endings because they invite judgment, not from others, but from himself. As long as things remain ongoing, unfinished, or interrupted, he can avoid the final accounting that being wrong would require. This is why Rick prefers disruption to conclusion. He would rather explode a situation than let it resolve. Resolution creates a before and after it draws a line. Rick lives in the space before lines are drawn, where everything can still be reframed as provisional. Being wrong would mean allowing the line to exist and standing on one side of it. Rick's relationship with meaning follows the same structure. He insists that meaning is fabricated, yet he behaves as though certain interpretations are non-negotiable. His worldview is not open-ended, it is rigid. That rigidity exists because flexibility would allow reinterpretation of the past. Rick does not fear that meaning is false. He fears that meaning might be flexible enough to indict him. This rigidity is also why Rick's humor is so aggressive. His jokes are not playful, they are preemptive. Humor becomes a way to dominate interpretation before anyone else can offer one. If Rick laughs first, he controls the frame. If he controls the frame, he controls the meaning. Being wrong would mean losing control of the frame and allowing others, or himself, to reinterpret events in ways he cannot manage. The show consistently places Rick in situations where his interpretation is not the only viable one. Other characters respond differently to the same chaos. They suffer, adapt, or hope without adopting Rick's conclusions. These parallel responses are not positioned as superior, but they are positioned as viable. Viability is the threat. If multiple responses can coexist, then Rick's response stops being inevitable. Rick's fear intensifies whenever that coexistence becomes visible. He does not debate alternatives. He destabilizes them. He introduces chaos, escalation, or humiliation to prevent comparison from settling. Comparison requires stillness. Stillness allows the question he avoids to surface. What if the way I lived was not the only honest way to live? This question is unbearable because it reframes his pain. Pain in Rick's worldview is proof of truth. It is the cost of seeing clearly. If pain could have been experienced differently, then it stops being proof and becomes evidence of choice. That transformation would strip his suffering of its justification. Being wrong would not erase pain, it would reassign it. Rick's fear also shapes how he understands forgiveness from others. When others forgive him, he often reacts with discomfort rather than relief. Forgiveness undermines his narrative of inevitability. If someone forgives him, They are implicitly saying that his actions were not dictated by truth, but chosen under constraint. Forgiveness reframes harm as relational rather than cosmic. Rick resists this reframing because it pulls his behavior out of abstraction and back into human scale. Human scale is where Rick is least comfortable. Cosmic indifference is easy to navigate because it does not require reciprocity. Human relationships do. They involve memory, expectation, and response. Being wrong in a human context means facing disappointment, not as a philosophical concept, but as a lived reaction in someone else. Rick avoids that proximity by intellectualizing, distancing, or escalating beyond the human scale entirely. As time goes on, Rick's fear of being wrong does not diminish. It becomes more procedural. It stops appearing as explosive defensiveness and starts appearing as routine avoidance. He knows which situations to exit, which conversations to derail, which emotions to suppress. The fear no longer needs to announce itself. It has become infrastructure. This is what makes Rick dangerous to himself. Fear embedded in infrastructure is harder to challenge than fear expressed openly. It does not feel like fear anymore. It feels like normal operation. Rick's life becomes optimized around not encountering falsification. He is not searching for truth. He is managing risk. The show never suggests that this strategy will catastrophically fail in a single moment. Instead, it suggests something quieter and more unsettling, that the strategy will work indefinitely at the cost of depth. Rick will continue to survive, continue to function, continue to dominate environments, and continue to avoid the one experiment that matters, testing whether his certainty is actually true. Being wrong in the end would not mean that Rick misunderstood the universe. It would mean that he misunderstood himself. It would mean that his intelligence revealed options he refused to examine, that his pain narrowed his vision rather than sharpening it, and that his certainty was a coping mechanism mistaken for clarity. Rick Sanchez is afraid of being wrong because being wrong would force him to admit that the hardest truths were not cosmic, but personal. That the universe did not take something from him, he gave something up. And once that possibility is acknowledged, certainty can no longer function as shelter. So Rick keeps moving, keeps mocking, keeps controlling, and keeps insisting that nothing else was possible. Not because he knows it is true, but because finding out otherwise would require him to stop running long enough to grieve the life he never allowed himself to test.